I'm going to talk today about evil. This is a topic, as you've heard, I've been working on for quite some time. And I'm working on a book project on this topic now. I've written lots of papers, but I've never really been able to get the book finished on it. And so that's what I'm trying to do this spring. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think are some common misconceptions about the concept of evil. And then I'm going to give you a little glimpse at what I'm going to say in the book about evil, so how I conceive of the notion. I'm going to start off with a little bit about the aims and the methodology of my research, and I'm doing this primarily for non-philosophers, just so that we're all on the same page and we have an understanding of what it is I'm doing in the presentation. So I'll start there. And then after that, I'll discuss what some other philosophers have said about the nature of evil, and then I'll get to my own version of it. Okay, so the first thing I always need to say when I'm talking about evil is that there are really two moral concepts of evil. There's a broad moral concept of evil and a narrow moral concept of evil. So, according to the broad concept of evil, evil is just anything that's bad or wrong. So sometimes people talk about evil this way: oh, the evils of the world. And that's just anything that's bad or wrong, like a harmless lie is evil in that sense, or a toothache, or a snake bite, right? So, just anything bad or wrong. But then we also use the concept of evil, or the term evil, to refer to a narrow concept, which means the morally most despicable sorts of actions, people and institutions, etc. And when we refer to, say, Hitler as evil, or mass murder as evil, or sadistic torture as evil, we're using this narrow concept of evil. So not just anything bad or wrong, but we're talking about the worst sorts of stuff, like the really bad stuff. And that's what I focus on in my research, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. But it's important to get that clear to start with. Another thing that it's important to be clear about is that there are different sorts of evil things, or things that can be evil. So we can talk about evil actions, or we can talk about evil people or evil characters. We can talk about evil feelings, evil attitudes, social practices. And so it's important not to get these things mixed up. Sometimes there can be a little bit of slippage when talking about evil. You start talking about evil actions and then end up talking about evil persons. So it's important to recognize that there's these different sorts of things that can be evil. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is primarily evil actions, different views about evil actions, what it is that makes an action evil. I'm also going to talk about evil attitudes, because on the view that I have now, the one that I've developed, my most recent one, is a view that says that evil attitudes are really crucial for understanding evil actions. So I'll talk about both evil actions and evil attitudes. Okay, so now on to the aims of my research. So the purpose of my research is to get clear about the concept of evil and its relationship to other moral concepts. So, for instance, tonight what I'm going to talk about is the nature uh, of evil actions and how they're distinct from merely wrongful actions. So, so that's what I want to get clear about. I want to be able to come up with a theory ultimately that would pick out all evil actions as evil, but not pick out as evil any actions which are not evil. So I want a theory that is going to capture all of the evil actions and not say that some action which we don't think is evil is evil. So it's a theory that will elucidate the concept, this concept of the morally most despicable sorts of things. And my methodology, the way I'm going to do this, is what philosophers call conceptual analysis. And so this is a typical methodology within philosophy. And the way conceptual analysis works is that what we're doing is we're trying to improve our understanding of a concept by considering a broad range of cases, possible and actual cases. And so the idea is to come up with a theory of the concept that is consistent with our judgments about cases. So we want a theory that will fit all of our the judgments that we might make about different cases. And if we have a theory that isn't consistent with our judgments about cases, both possible and actual cases, then we either need to change the theory or we need to revise our judgment about the cases. So, for instance, just to give you an example of what I have in mind here, is let's suppose that we think that using torture for interrogation purposes is evil, is an evil thing to do, an evil practice. If we develop a theory of evil that says that torture for interrogation purposes is not evil, then what we need to do is either modify our theory of evil or we need to revise our judgment about torture for the purpose of interrogation, right? We'll have to change our view about that, or we're going to have to get a new theory that that is able to account for our judgments here. So what we're trying to do is get to a situation where all of our judgments about these cases are consistent with the theory that we have. And the philosopher John Rawls calls this state or condition where our judgments about cases is consistent with our theory, reflective equilibrium, right? And so that's what we're trying to do. That's what I'm trying to do when I'm working on evil, is try to get to reflective equilibrium on the concept of evil. I want to get a theory that will capture all the cases. Now, when trying to achieve reflective equilibrium, I think that the best approach is to, the most efficient way to do this is to focus on what philosophers call counterexamples. So what's a counterexample? A counterexample is essentially a case that shows that we must either reject or modify a theory. You can see the pictures that I've got up there of counterexamples. So these are a couple possible counterexamples for certain theories of evil. Let me explain how a case might be a counterexample. We all think that there's nothing evil about eating cake, right? That's why I got the cake picture up there. Nothing evil about eating cake. If we had a theory of evil that implied that eating cake was evil, then, right, that would be a problem because we don't think that eating cake is, in fact, evil. So we would have to change our theory. We'd have to reject that theory because it implies that eating cake is evil, and we don't think that eating cake is evil. Here's another example. Hitler. Most of us think that, well, I think all of us would say that Hitler is a great evildoer, right? I mean, Hitler is the paradigm of evil, right? And what Hitler did during the Holocaust, was extremely evil. And so if we have a theory of evil that implies that Hitler was not an evildoer, well, then we've got a problem, or at least we got some serious explaining to do, right? So our theory of evil should capture the idea that Hitler is evil, or Hitler was an evildoer. And so if our theory didn't have that implication, then Hitler would be a counterexample to that theory, right? So that's how counterexamples work. I'm going to be using counterexamples tonight in my analysis of different theories of evil. Now, one thing that you might have been wondering while I was talking just now, when I was saying that we think that eating cake is not evil and we think that Hitler is evil, is, well, who's this we? What's this we you're talking about? Why are you saying we, Calder? Because, different people might have different views about this, right? An action might seem evil to one person, but not seem evil to another person. And this might be true, especially if We're talking about people who have very different worldviews or people who come from different cultures. And so I think that that is true, right? Um, we might think that different people have different views. However, while I think that there can be differences of opinion among borderline cases, I actually don't think at base, apart from disagreements about empirical facts, I don't think that there is a lot of disagreement in our thinking about evil once we get clear about what we're talking about. So I want to say a few things now to get clear about what we're talking about. And then I hope that you'll agree that really there probably isn't that much disagreement, not as much disagreement as you might initially think about this. So, one thing that is important when we're getting clear about what we're talking about here is that evil is just an English word, right? So when we use the word evil, we're using an English word to capture something. This English word, if you want to look at the etymology, comes from Old English Jafel or Old German Übel. And it means something like bad or transgression. It did in the old days, or misfortune. Oftentimes it was applied to foods and smells and things like that. But we could use this word to mean whatever we want, right? My skateboarding friends like to use the word sick to mean really great, right? Like that ramp was sick, dude. And I don't think they mean it was unhealthy, right? So you can do that. And so people might start to use the word evil to mean, I don't know, delicious or something like that, right? And it might come about that people always use the word evil to mean delicious. That cake was still evil. That was an evil cake, an evil meal that you made. Now, if that's true, people are using the term evil to refer to something that I'm not talking about. Okay, so sometimes people use evil to refer to things maybe that I'm not focused on, but I'm not really concerned about the word evil or the etymology of the word evil. I'm interested in the concept that the English word evil, I think, typically refers to when it's used in moral, political, legal discussions, when we're talking about the morally most despicable sorts of things like sadistic torture and the Holocaust and Hitler and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm interested in, that concept. So I just want to get clear about that before I kind of move on too much more. Another thing I want to get clear about is that I am talking about the concept that is being used in secular discussions, secular moral, political, legal discussions, and not a religious concept of evil that sometimes I think gets confused with this moral concept of evil, right? So sometimes people refer to evil and they have something supernatural in mind, right? Maybe they mean by evil going against God's commands or being in league with the devil or possessed by the devil, right? So there's some sort of supernatural element involved in some usage of the term evil. I call this a religious conception of evil. And this religious conception of evil is sometimes used when talking about fiction, certainly used in a religious context. But I don't think that that's what we're talking about when we say that that Hitler is evil, the Holocaust is evil, Ted Bundy is evil. I don't think that that's really what we're talking about. People who don't believe in God or the devil can very easily use these terms, do use these terms to refer to the morally most despicable sorts of things, and they use the term evil quite self-consciously. They don't say just bad or wrong. They need a term that has a lot more gravitas to it. Okay, so I'm not talking about the religious conception of evil either. Now, most people who speak English and contemporary Western society, they know what I mean when I'm talking about evil. Most people know what I'm talking about when I use evil to mean the morally most despicable sorts of actions, characters, etc. However, there can still be some conceptual confusion, right? Because even if you use the concept of evil, and you're referring to what I'm talking about here, the narrow concept of evil, there can still be some confusion because people may not be completely clear about what they're saying, what the implications are for what they're saying. They probably haven't thought that deeply or broadly uh, about how far the concept of evil extends to actual and possible cases. They haven't maybe thought about the relationship between evil and wrongdoing and badness. Um, they haven't thought about the what philosophers call the necessary and sufficient conditions, right? Those conditions that are necessary to make an action evil, those and are jointly sufficient to make an action evil. And so if they haven't thought about that, then they can end up being a bit unclear about what evil is really like. And they can even end up with some contradictory sorts of beliefs about the concept of evil and not even really realize it. So, what I attempt to do in my work is to get clear about this. I want to sort of clear up this confusion. I also want to clear up any disagreements that might follow from this conclusion. And I think that this is an important thing to do for a number of reasons, and I'll just mention a few now. But one is that evil is a really heavy word to use. That's the greatest form of moral condemnation. And if you make an ascription of evil, you say that somebody's evil or that what they did is evil, and that's wrong, right? You're misapplying the concept. Then that can be a heavy judgment, can be overly harsh, can lead to overly harsh punishment. So it does really have practical implications whether you get these things right or not. It's also important to understand what evil is if you want to respond to evil. We think that there's a lot of evil and that we need to do something about it. Well, we have to be clear about what evil is first before and how it works before we're able to probably tackle it properly. Evil can also set priorities for us as well. If something's evil, well, then maybe we should attend to that first before we attend to just mere injustices or wrongs. And it also puts limits on what we can do. We can't use evil, like evil means to fight, injustice or other sorts of things. So I think there are practical reasons why it's important to get clear about the notion of evil and to clear up this conceptual confusion that's out there. Okay, so let's just now turn to how some people have gone about this. And I think a good place to start is to look at what some theorists have thought about the relationship between evil and wrongdoing. Most theorists believe that evil is a species of wrongdoing. That is, that an evil action is a wrongful action that has certain extra qualities to it, right? Certain other essential characteristics, such as certain sorts of motives, certain sorts of feelings, certain sorts of harms. And so I'm not going to dispute that today, that evil actions are a species of wrongdoing. But what I want to talk about is what are these extra characteristics that are needed in order to make an action not just wrong, but evil. So I'm going to start with one view that is presented by Hillel Steiner, a British philosopher. Steiner's effect-based account says that the extra quality that makes something not just wrong but evil is feelings of pleasure in doing what's wrong. So according to Steiner, an evil action is a wrongful action that is pleasurable for the doer, pleasurable for the doer to perform. And I think that there's some reason to think that this is plausible, because we can think of cases, some paradigms of evil that do involve pleasure. You've got the villain that's got somebody tied up on the train tracks and they're cackling like, and so we do think of some paradigm examples of evil that involve pleasure. The Austin Powers movies, Dr. Evil is always, enjoying like making, people suffer and that sort of thing. So So I think that there's some initial plausibility to it. However, I'm going to get to some counterexamples here. I think that there are some problems with this view. Here are two what I take to be counterexamples to Steiner's theory. What about taking pleasure in stealing gum from a gas station? Taking pleasure in yelling at a bus driver for no good reason? Sure. So these are wrongful actions. You shouldn't steal gum from a gas station. You shouldn't yell at a bus driver. And you could take pleasure in that, but it doesn't seem like these actions would be morally grave enough for evil, right? That doesn't sound like evil, even though they would turn out to be evil on Steiner's theory, because they are wrongful actions that are that involve pleasure. But I don't think it's plausible to say that they're evil actions because they just lack the moral gravity required for evil, right? They're just not that morally despicable. And so that's a problem for Steiner's theory. Now, there's a way that you might be able to fix it. You could be able to add a further component to evil, to the theory of evil. If you add a further component, you might be able to come up with a more plausible theory. And I think that a pretty obvious component that you might want to add is a harm component, right? Because I think that a lot of people think that what makes evil actions so, morally grave is that the victim suffers a lot of harm. Typical cases that we think of involving evil that involve a lot of harm. And so we could modify Steiner's account by including a harm component and say something like this. An evil action is a wrongful action that results in a lot of harm and that's pleasurable to perform. And I think that this does a much better job because now on this theory, evil actions do seem to be a lot more morally grave because they have to involve a lot of harm. And so stealing gum from a gas station is not going to turn out to be evil on this theory because there's not a lot of harm. And yelling at a bus driver for no good reason is not going to turn out to be evil because there's not a lot of harm. But I still think there are some counterexamples. How about a cold-blooded contract killer, right? They don't take any pleasure in killing their victims. They just do it for money. What they do causes a lot of harm, but it isn't done for pleasure. And so that means that it doesn't turn out to be evil on Steiner's theory. Or what about the Nazi who kills for anti-Semitic reasons? And so they don't take any pleasure. People like Himmler, who was apparently sort of squeamish about the killing that went on during the Holocaust, his actions, his killing, wouldn't turn out to be evil on this view because there's no pleasure involved. So since the modified account still has that pleasure component, it's still a problem. It still leads to these kinds of counterexamples. And I think what we learn from this is that really there isn't an effect component to evil, that evil actions need not involve feelings of pleasure or any other sorts of feelings, in fact, if you think about it. But what about that harm component, though, right? The harm component made Steiner's theory a lot more plausible, right? So why not think that evil actions are wrongful actions that produce a lot of harm, right? That seems a lot more plausible. And that, in fact, is what a lot of theorists have done. They have given accounts that have a significant harm component to it. So, for instance, Claude Card has a theory of evil that says that evils are reasonably foreseeable, intolerable harms produced by inexcusable wrongs. So the intolerable harms is a key component of Card's theory. And that seems to add a lot of plausibility to it because intolerable harms are morally grave, and we think that evil is morally grave. Or John Keeks has a similar view, says that evil actions are wrongful actions that cause serious excessive harm and are malevolently motivated and inexcusable. So yeah, that seems like a good way to go. Now, interestingly though, there are some other theorists especially in Britain for some reason. I don't know why in Britain, but there's some theorists who believe that evil doesn't actually need to be harmful. That really it's wrong to think that evil actions must produce harm. And two of these theorists, as I said, they tend to be British. There's Eve Gerard and Stephen DeWitts. Gerard, they give a couple examples. These are cases that they believe are harmless evils, so actions that are evil, but they don't involve any harm. So here's one that Gerard gives. It's a case, and apparently this actually is an actual case that happened in Iraq at some point in the early 90s, where you have a tyrannical government that forces the parents of a young dissident to pay for the bullet that executed their child. So, and what Gerard says is that what's evil about this situation isn't so much the execution, but what's evil is the government forcing the parents to pay for the bullet that executed their child, right? And so what Gerard's saying is like, but there's no harm involved, right? It's just, there's the harm is the execution, but what's evil is forcing them to pay for the bullet. So there's one case. Here's one that's given by DeWitts. So we're supposed to imagine that Fred is a funeral director, and Tim comes to him before he dies and says, "Fred, I want you to do something for me when I die. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to cut me up and take pieces of me and put it into food that you feed at my funeral. So when people come to the funeral, they're gonna have a meal after the funeral, and parts of me are going to be in there, and I would like you to do that." And Fred thinks, "Oh, that's a great idea." And Fred, does it and takes ghoulish delight in thinking that people are eating parts of Tim. DeWitts thinks, "Look, there's no harm because we're supposing that they're not going to get sick from it, right? There's nothing, it's nothing unhealthy about eating a human flesh, I guess. But it's still evil, according to DeWitts." Here's his other case. Imagine that there's this guy, Bert, who has this secret dungeon in his house, and he tortures and murders Sam in this secret dungeon. The thing is, Sam is not a human being. Sam is a very human-looking like robot. So the idea here is that since Sam is a robot and not an actual, flesh and blood human being, he's not going to experience any pain, and therefore there's no harm. But still, DeWitts would say, what Bert does is evil. Okay, so let's think about these cases. I'm doing okay. Here's my view. I'm just going to give you my view on these cases. I don't think they actually do what they're supposed to do. I don't think that they show us that evil actions need not produce harm. Take the first case, Gerard's case. I think it would actually be quite harmful to force the parents to pay for, the bullet that executed their child, right? I think that the emotional suffering that would go on, they're making the parents kind of complicit in a way in the wrongful killing of their child. So I don't think that's a case that's not harmful but evil. I think it's evil, but not harmful. With DeWitt's cases, I think it's sort of the other thing. I think that, yes, they do seem to be actions that are not harmful. I'll agree. There's probably you're going to be okay if you eat human flesh. And so there's no harm caused by cooking Tim in this sort of funeral dinner. There's no harm, perhaps, in torturing a robot and killing the robot. But I don't think these are plausibly evil either. I don't think they're grave enough for evil, right? I don't think there's the moral gravity there. I mean, what Bert does by torturing and killing this robot, I mean, it's probably a character defect. I mean, he could be a better person. He could do better things with his time, I think, but I don't think that it's evil. And when it comes to Fred, it's the same sort of, it's ghoulish but I don't think that it's necessarily evil. However, I do think there are cases, genuine cases, where there is harmless evils. So these cases don't do it, but I do think that there is a case. So what about this one? Damien decides to set off a large bomb in a busy shopping district, which will kill and maim hundreds of people. However, for some reason, the bomb doesn't go off and no one's harmed. I think that this is a case of evil that doesn't produce any harm, right? Because I think that what Damien does is morally despicable. He's trying to blow up a whole bunch of people, right? Murder all these people. We're presuming for no good reason, right? Just because the bomb doesn't go off doesn't mean that what Damien did wasn't evil, is what I'm suggesting, okay? And so you can have harmless evils, but notice, though, that there is a connection with harm here because he was trying to make for a lot of harm. So there's got to be a connection with harm, and even though the harm doesn't have to be produced. Okay, so one thing I think that my theory does, which I'm going to get to now, is explain this connection. So there is a connection between harm and evil. The trick is to be able to explain what that connection is, and I think that my theory does a good job at explaining that connection. Okay, so here's my view. So I think that it's not certain sorts of feelings or certain sorts of harms that are essential for evil, but it's a certain sort of attitude that's essential for evil. And evil actions are just actions that are motivated by or follow from or a consequence of these evil attitudes. So that's why we have to think about what evil attitudes are. Okay, so what is an evil attitude? What I've discovered, as I said, what you have to do as a philosopher is you have to think about a whole bunch of different cases, try to think about how the concept fits in with other concepts or other things you believe. So after thinking about a wide range of cases and thinking about the relationship between evil and wrongdoing and vice and badness, reading very critically a lot of literature on the topic, I've come up with the idea that what's particularly salient about evil is that the evildoer insufficiently values someone else's freedom from extreme harm. This is key. This is a key way to put it. There's an even more specific way to put this, or one that's a little bit more exact, and that is that evildoers value a lesser good more than someone else's freedom from extreme harm. That's what's key to evil. I'm taking these two phrases to be equivalent. So sometimes I'll use one, sometimes I'll use the other. Now, these sorts of attitudes can subsist independently, right? They can subsist all themselves. You can just have this attitude. But oftentimes, they are noticed even just by the person who has them themselves, the agent themselves, through various acts of commission and omission. So there are sort of two forms that these attitudes take when they lead to actions. There can be causing extreme harm for no good reason and allowing extreme harm for no good reason. So let's give some examples. The sadistic serial killer, such as Ted Bundy, who liked to torture and rape women before killing them. What Bundy does is, or his attitude is, that he values his own pleasure more than his victims' freedom from extreme harm. So that's how Bundy has an evil attitude. The contract killer. The contract killer also values a lesser good, that is money, more than his victims' freedom from extreme harm. And so That's another case of having an evil attitude, of insufficiently valuing someone else's freedom from extreme harm. The last case I want to give comes from a paper by Peter Singer, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Singer talks about somebody who's walking to work one day, and as they're going to work, they notice that in a shallow pond, there is a child that's drowning. Child drowning in a shallow pond. This person, we're supposing, is able-bodied and could easily go into the pond and rescue the child that's drowning in the shallow pond. However, if they did that, they would get their clothes dirty and maybe they'd be a bit late for work. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that it would be evil for the person to just walk on past and leave the child to drown in the shallow pond, right? And this would be captured by my theory of evil attitudes, because what they would be doing would be they would be valuing a lesser good, that is keeping their clothes clean and getting to work on time, over the child's freedom from extreme harm for the child. So I think that those are some good examples. And this view that I have here, I think it does a good job, as I said before, about explaining the relationship between harm and evil. Because on this view, evil actions need not produce harm. They need only follow from an evil attitude, that is, from valuing a lesser good more than someone else's freedom from extreme harm. So you don't have to produce harm in order to do an evil attitude, or sorry, perform an evil action on this view. But you just have to act from an evil attitude. And somebody who attempts harm, right, like Damien does, they actually would be performing an evil action on this view, because they're acting from an attitude that insufficiently values their victim's freedom from extreme harm. So attempting to cause a lot of harm turns out to be evil on this view. But cooking people and feeding them at a funeral, that doesn't turn out to be evil on this view, because they are not valuing a lesser good more than someone else's freedom from extreme harm. They're not insufficiently valuing other people's freedom from extreme harm, because there's no extreme harm that's being caused by cooking this person and feeding it to the people at the funeral. So those cases don't turn out to be evil on my view. So I think that's a good thing. Okay. Now, while I think that my view is pretty good at answering a lot of the questions and making sense of this connection between harm and evil, there are problems with this account. In particular, Hitler becomes a problem, unfortunately. And that's a big problem for somebody who's studying evil. If Hitler's your problem, you got a big problem. So how is Hitler a problem for me? Well, as architect and instigator of the Holocaust, Hitler caused unimaginable harm to European Jews during his reign in Germany. However, there are reasons to think that Hitler genuinely believed that European Jews were irrevocably evil and a grave danger to Germans and other European ethnic groups. Or at least we can suppose that he genuinely believed that. If so, we might say that Hitler did not value a lesser good over the Jewish people's freedom from extreme harm. He valued a greater good, the good of European peoples more generally, which he believed could only be safeguarded by the elimination of the Jewish minority over Jewish people's freedom from extreme harm. And so he doesn't have an evil attitude on the theory of evil attitudes argued for here. So this is a problem. Oops. But I think what this objection does is it points to the fact that I have to be a little bit clear about what I mean when I say that someone who has an evil attitude values a lesser good more than a victim's freedom from extreme harm. Because they could mean two different things, right? I could mean two different things here. I could mean that someone with an evil someone with an evil attitude must value what they believe is a lesser good more than someone else's freedom from extreme harm. Or they might mean someone with an evil attitude must value what is in fact a lesser good more than someone else's freedom from extreme harm. And so what's my answer? Well, it's actually kind of a bit of both in a way. On my view, if they believe that they value a lesser good more than someone else's freedom from extreme harm, then they do have an evil attitude, if that's what they believe. If Hitler thought, you know what, I'm just doing this, I just want to kill Jews, I really don't think that anything good is going to come from all this killing Jews, but I don't really care because I just want to kill Jews. If that was his thing, then that would be an evil attitude. But if they don't believe that they value a lesser good more than someone else's freedom from extreme harm, when in fact they actually do, right, then they might still have an evil attitude. It's going to depend on why it is that they have the false belief, right? So that's going to be the key here. And so it's important to recognize that sometimes believing that we do not value a lesser good more than someone else's freedom from extreme harm does preclude us from having an evil attitude. Sometimes this is the case, but it depends on why we have the false belief, what the supporting reasons are, what the origin is. So for example, if Hitler was raised in an isolated community, never had any contact with Jews, was systematically indoctrinated into believing that Jews are inherently evil and a grave danger to Germans and other European peoples, then he would have had good reason to believe that the good that would come from exterminating the Jews would outweigh the Jewish suffering. And so in that case, even though he in fact valued a lesser good more than freedom from extreme harm for the European Jews, he would not have had an evil attitude. The thing is that this was not the situation that Hitler was in at all. Hitler did not have good reasons to believe that the Jews were a danger to Germans and other Europeans. Hitler was what I call a self-deceptive evildoer, and I think this is a really important class of evildoer, the self-deceptive evildoer. So let me just say a few things about what that is. So you got people with their heads in the sand there. So my understanding of self-deception, I get a lot of it from Michael Martin and David Jones. According to Martin, self-deception is the evasion of full self-acknowledgement of some truth, or of what one would view as the truth if one were to confront an issue squarely. The truth or apparent truths may concern oneself, others, one's immediate situation, or the world at large. The evasion may have any number of motives, although what is evaded will be perceived as unpleasant or onerous in some way. And so self-deception in this sense is generally accomplished through a sustained project of evidence avoidance and rationalization, which is at least initially partly conscious and over which the self-deceiver has at least some control. David Jones says that there are actually more than this, but at least 4 sort of ways in which self-deceivers generally are able to evade acknowledgement of the truth. One way is by avoiding thinking about the truth. Another is by distracting oneself with rationalizations that are contrary to the truth. Systematically failing to make inquiries that would lead to evidence of the truth. Or ignoring available evidence of the truth, distracting oneself, distracting one's attention from the truth. So, for example, Hitler was a self-deceptive evildoer, and Jones relates in his book, which is a great book called Moral Responsibility in the Holocaust. Jones talks about Hitler, and Jones discusses how Hitler throughout his whole life, refused to accept any of his own failures or the failures of his adopted country, which was Germany. He was Austrian originally. Instead, he blamed others and sought out escapist fantasies. For example, at the age of 16, Hitler quit school and he moved to Vienna to study painting and architecture at the Fine Arts Academy. Even though he hadn't been accepted to the school yet, he just applied and then he moved to Vienna. When his application was rejected, he simply stayed on in Vienna for another year and reapplied without doing anything at all to improve his chances of being accepted to the school. When he was rejected a second time, Hitler just blamed the academy for failing to recognize his genius and continued to fantasize that he was a great artist. After that, he made postcards in Vienna to escape a life of poverty, but eventually he joined the German army in World War I. And soon after that, his self-esteem became tied to the success of the German army and the superiority of the German people. When in 1918 Germany was forced to capitulate to its enemies, Hitler blamed the humiliation on a Jewish conspiracy. Later, he would blame unemployment and a host of other problems on the Jewish people, but he made no attempt to establish the truth of these claims against the Jewish people by seeking out unbiased evidence. Instead, he sought out anti-Semitic pamphlets, which were to any thinking observer wildly out of touch with reality. I think it's also noteworthy to point out that Hitler was not a victim of systematic anti-Semitic indoctrination as a child. Hitler came from a middle-class Austrian family that wasn't particularly anti-Semitic. He had at least some positive social interactions with Jewish people. He even had some Jewish friends when he was living in Vienna. So I think that given his personal experiences with Jews, it should have been pretty obvious to him that Jews were not inherently evil or particularly dangerous, that they're just like Germans, other Germans in important respects. They had capacities for love, kindness, compassion, etc. Hitler came to believe that the Jews were inherently evil and the root of Germany's problems because he wanted to. He deceived himself into believing this. And so Hitler was responsible for his ignorance, and for this reason, had an evil attitude towards the Jewish population, even though he didn't believe that he valued a lesser good more than their freedom from extreme harm. So, in order to make sense of Hitler's case, and also the fact that sometimes ignorance can preclude us from having an evil attitude, we're going to need another component to our theory of evil, and I call this an epistemic component because it's a knowledge component. And so the epistemic component of the theory is this: to have an evil attitude, we must either believe that we value a lesser good more than someone else's freedom from extreme harm, or else lack defensible reasons to believe otherwise. And this is exactly the situation with Hitler. Hitler had an evil attitude because he didn't have a good reason to believe that he valued a lesser good more than the Jewish people's freedom from extreme harm. And so overall, my view is this: an evil attitude consists in insufficiently valuing someone else's freedom from extreme harm, while either believing that this is what we're doing or else failing to have a good reason to believe otherwise. An evil action, then, is just simply an action that is motivated from or follows from or is a consequence of an evil attitude. And that's about all the time I have now. So thanks very much.